Welcome to What We Didn't Say on Sunday. Well, this really is what I didn't say on Sunday. My name is Jordan Massey, and I'm here with no one. A special episode, really an unfortunate episode, because you just have to deal with me. The purpose of this podcast is the name of the podcast. Every week at Westside, someone preaches, and I preach this Sunday at our Newberry Road campus, and every time that someone preaches, there's something we didn't get to. Things left on the cutting room floor. We call them our sermon leftovers, and the purpose of this podcast is to share those things with you, to let you know what we didn't say on Sunday, or in this case, what I didn't say on Sunday. But once again, I am greeting no one. It's just me here in the studio. That's actually not true. Bo's right over there, running the camera and doing all the producer stuff. I'm just sitting here by myself. I won't be talking to anyone. You'll just have to look at my face the entire time. But we just want to make sure we're consistent as we can be. We're trying to grow in our consistency because we just appreciate our audience so much. And Pastor David and I hear regularly that you're listening and you're watching, and we just really, really appreciate that. We're grateful for you. So we want to make sure you have something to hear, even if it's just me this week. And but we're going to jump right to it. I don't have any conversation to have. This is going to be a short episode. And we're going to begin with a 3-minute sermon recap. Every single time we do this show, we want to make sure you know what we did say before we get to what we didn't say. And maybe you forgot what was said and you were there. Maybe you weren't there and you need to know for the first time. I need to remind myself before I tell you what I didn't say, what I did say. So in 3 minutes or less, here was my sermon from Sunday morning. So I preached on Revelation chapter 4, this throne room scene that John gets. And my main idea was that when we see God, when we truly see God, we worship him. That's the only response we can when we actually see him and recognize him. The problem is, as I talked about on Sunday, is many of us, we fail to see him for he truly is. And because of that, that leads to apathetic or lazy worship. And that's not just hands raised. Worship is surrendered obedience. And so it's hands raised on Sunday, but it's also bowing before the Lord in obedience to whatever he calls and surrender to him as the creator and us as creatures. And so we just looked at John's vision, what he sees, and made a few notes about, hey, what is it that we see about God that leads us to worship? And the first thing we saw is that John sees the beauty of God's control. He recognizes that despite his circumstance, despite what's in front of the curtain, his experience, that God is still in control of all of it. That the Jesus pulls back the curtain for John, and he gets to see what's going on behind the scenes. And what's going on behind the scenes is God is still on the throne. And when we recognize that we're not in the driver's seat, when we recognize God is the one who's in control, that leads to worship always. We surrender to the one who's in control of all things, to the one who's sovereign. But it's not just that. John isn't just manipulated into worshiping God because God is in control and he has to. He's also compelled by this beautiful vision of the Lord. And so John also sees the wonder of God's glory. And so when we truly see the wonder of God's glory, we're always led to worship. And this is this vision John gets of jasper and carnelian and a rainbow emerald and flashes of lightning and peals of thunder and this throne room scene where everyone's worshiping. He sees the wonder of God's glory, and it's even described. God's holy, God's almighty, God's the creator, God's eternal. All of these descriptions of God lead us to the only thing we can do. When we truly recognize that, we worship. And then thirdly, John sees this grand vision of the whole cosmos worshiping. And so when we see the reality that everyone will worship one day, we end up worshiping as well. And so we just looked at John's throne room scene and we said, hey, when we truly see this, when we truly get it, we will always worship. And my application was simple, that we need to see God more. And there's ways we do that. We see God more in prayer and devotion and study. The more time we spend with the Lord, the more time we spend in his word, the more time we do that amongst other believers, the better we know God, the more we grow in our knowledge of him, and not just intellectual knowledge, but experiential knowledge, and the more we are inclined to completely and totally worship him. So we see him in prayer and study. We also see him more in obedience. And one of the greatest ways you can encounter the goodness and the presence and the wonder of God's glory is doing something that seems reckless for him. And I'm out of time. I had one other application point that I'm not going to mention. I don't have anyone here to hold me accountable. So I just have to stop now, and you'll have to wonder. But you could watch my sermon. If you go to westsidebaptist.org and you click on sermons up at the top of the screen, or if you're on the mobile version, you click on sermons in the control menu, you can see my sermon there, and you can hear the third application point, which I'm not going to tell you now, because that is what I did say on Sunday in 3 minutes, a little more than 3 minutes. But now we're going to talk about what I didn't say. What did I not get to? What were some of the things left on the cutting room floor? And we begin this section of the podcast with sermon bloopers. And I can tell you the only real blooper I had wasn't in the sermon, but it was the night before. And I hope the Lord lifted me up. But as many of you know, I have a newborn. And our newborn baby boy on Saturday night decided to give my wife and I probably the worst night we've ever had as parents. So I got up on that platform to preach, and I had slept about 45 minutes total the night before. And if you watch and you look closely, you can see it in my eyes. You can see I'm just tired. And I've felt tired in both services. But for whatever reason, God is always gracious in those moments. And he cares for us. And I think he cared for me and was gracious. And I was able to say some coherent things. But that was probably my big sermon blooper, apart from maybe going on and on too long about the Jags, which I have a tendency of doing because I unfortunately love them very much. So those are some sermon bloopers. But getting into more of the meat of what I didn't say on Sunday, we think about historical context, that sometimes there's things that just don't have time for, that are in the culture, that are in the city, that are in the context of the passage. And in Revelation, there's so much historical context. There's so much going on in the Asia Minor province of Rome, in the Roman Empire. But there's also this historical context of the Jewish people that the book of Revelation, more than any book in the New Testament, is interacting with and echoing and speaking about the Old Testament. And there's so many different things here we could point to. One of the things I didn't mention at all as we think about historical context would be, what is the deal with the jasper and the carnelian? What's the deal with the rainbow that has an appearance of emerald? I said, and I'll say it here as well, I don't think you have to know the historical context of jasper and carnelian and emerald to understand what's happening here. I think John wants you to feel what he felt when he saw the Lord, and he describes the Lord in this way that just kind of makes you go, whoa. But I do think there is something there. It's not a code, but it is symbolic, right? It's not a code that you're meant to crack, but it is symbolic of something. And really, as we think about jasper and carnelian, this rainbow appearance of an emerald, these are elements that were considered precious. They were elements that were considered strong. They were elements that were considered to be of great value. And so when John sees the Lord and he appears in this way, he begins to see and describe, in some ways, the character of the Lord that he sees on the throne, that the Lord is worthy of all praise. He's worthy of value. He's precious, and he has the strength about him that's evident from just his appearance alone. There's also, some will point to the rainbow perhaps being a callback to God's covenant with Noah, and a call to God's faithfulness to his covenants and to his promises with his people. That's the one thing there. Another thing, this is kind of literary context, and we'll get into that, but it's historical context as well. As you look at the four living creatures, again, I don't want to complicate it too much. I want you to recognize this is just meant to be an embodiment of all creation. But we see creatures like this in a vision that Ezekiel has of the chariot of the Lord. And the creatures are what's carrying the chariot of the Lord. And so we see here that even in the vision that Ezekiel has, these creatures are a means of worship of God, that they bring God's presence from place to place. And John's doing the same thing here with this vision he has, where he sees these creatures are leading in worship. They're bringing the presence of God. They're pointing to the presence of God. They're leading in worship. So it seems like John's making a call or an echo to this vision that Ezekiel has. So that would be some of the historical context I didn't get into, and also literary context, because again, John is interacting heavily with the Old Testament. He wants you to look to the Old Testament as a lens through which you read the book of Revelation. And so he wants you to do that with Ezekiel. One of them that's maybe not as obvious, but I found to be so compelling, and I didn't mention it on Sunday, as we think about literary context. And literary context, by the way, it's the context of the literature. So literary context can be the preceding chapter. So it could be Revelation 3 is the literary context. It can be the whole book of Revelation, New Testament, the writings of John, all of the canon, right? That's all literary context. For me, John is doing something very similar when he sees the throne room and he sees God on the throne. He's doing something very similar as Psalm 29. Notice the similarities here. In Revelation 4, it says in verse 5, "From the throne came flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal." And I love that imagery of this peaceful scene that's before the throne. Pay attention to Psalm 29. Psalm 29 speaks of the Lord's voice, and it embodies or characterizes the Lord's voice as a storm. And so in Psalm 29, starting with verse 3, it says, "The voice of the Lord is over the waters." And if you've ever been to the beach when a storm is coming and you can see it out in the distance, that's what the psalmist is describing. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. Here it is. It's coming. The God of glory thunders. Okay, it's getting closer. We can hear it. The Lord over many waters. It's getting closer. We can see how big it is. It's spreading. It's over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. Again, it's getting louder. It's getting closer to us. Verse 5 of Psalm 29, "The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars." All right, it's here. It's lightning striking, breaking the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon a mountain to skip like a calf. This storm is so crazy, we've got earthquakes involved. And Syrian like a young wild ox. Again, these mountains are leaping. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth. This storm is so intense and crazy that deer are going into labor because of it. And strips the forest bare. In his temple all cry glory. And then pay attention here. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. And it ends with this. May the Lord bless his people with peace. So notice both in Revelation 4, this is really cool, we have the scene of a storm. Revelation 4, flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. And then in front of that, before it, you have a body of water. And in Psalm 29, it's a flood, right? So it's a chaotic body of water. In Revelation 4, it's a sea of glass. But then they both end with before the throne or before the Lord, the people of God have peace. And so I think that's the purpose of this sea of glass like crystal. You think of water as chaotic, but this water is still, it's peaceful. It's peaceful in front of this crazy storm. And in Psalm 29 as well, even despite the chaos and the craziness of the storm that is the voice of the Lord, the people of God have peace. And I think there's something beautiful there about how in the face of this kind of terrifying vision, this vision that leads us to wonder, it leads us to our knees, it leads us to fear the Lord, but that fear of the Lord in both Psalm 29 and in Revelation 4, it leads to peace. Because when we recognize who God is, we recognize we are his people, there's no other option but to have peace and rest in that. So I just love comparing those two passages. I think they're interacting with one another. Well, rather, I think John is calling on Psalm 29 as he describes this vision in Revelation 4. So that's some literary context. As far as theological ideas, my sermon was overwhelmingly theological. So I didn't leave a ton on the cutting room floor. There wasn't really many sermon leftovers there. I do think we need to think about our understanding of the spiritual world, and that needs to be more and more informed and well-rounded, because I did mention in my sermon, I think these 24 elders are spiritual beings of some sort, that they form some kind of divine council, that is Jesus, or John goes up into heaven and he sees this throne room where there's other thrones, and it's important to know that God created spiritual beings, spiritual beings that have power and influence in the world, and some of those spiritual beings have rebelled against God in the same way humans have, and there are evil spiritual beings, and there are spiritual beings of good that are for God's purposes and God's design, but that needs to be a part of our worldview. If that's not a part of our worldview, we're not going to get a lot of the book of Revelation. Now, there are a lot of people that disagree, that they don't think these elders are meant to be spiritual beings, that they're meant to be the 12 patriarchs and the 12 apostles, or kind of embodiments of Christians. But I think we're meant to think of them as spiritual beings. And either way, we need a better understanding of that kind of world that's true, that's real. Paul says we don't battle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of the air. And he's not talking about planes, right? He's talking about spiritual forces. So that's a really important part to be a part of our worldview. So the last thing as far as sermon leftovers or what I didn't say on Sunday is typically any type of illustration or story. And I don't ever have those because I barely have enough for my sermons. Pastor David is the one with the great stories. He's a master illustrator of the text with his life, and I'm just not very good at it. So I have to talk about the Jags or my children. That's about all I've got. So I don't really have any illustrations or stories to share that I didn't get to on Sunday morning. And that's really it. I told you it'd be a shorter episode because there's only one of us. It's just me. And that's what I didn't say on Sunday. So if you have more questions, we're going to start doing something interesting. And I'm just kind of shooting from the hip here, so I hope my producer, Bo, is okay with this. But you're going to hear more soon about how you, the audience, can interact with the show. We want to hear what your questions are. Maybe you're listening to the sermon and you think, oh, they didn't say that, but I'd love to know what they think about that. Here soon, some way, somehow, I actually don't know at this point, but be on the lookout because you're going to find out how you can participate as the audience, how you can engage. You can watch the sermon and then post your questions, and we'll answer your questions on the show in the near future. But again, we just thank you for listening. We hope that you're spreading the word, especially amongst the people of Westside, because that's really who this show is for. And we hope that if you are listening regularly, that you like, you subscribe, you give us a 5-star review. If you don't think we're worth a 5-star review, we just ask that you wouldn't review us at all. Hey, we're just thankful for our listeners. And this coming Sunday, we're going to preach again. And when we preach again, we're preaching on Revelation 5, the vision of the Lamb and the scroll being open is a beautiful passage, and there's going to be a ton that we don't get to, a ton left on the cutting room floor. And so next week, we'll be back with you, and it will be us, most likely. It won't just be me. Next week, we'll be back with you to share what we didn't say on Sunday.